Hey, Sarah.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm pretty good today.
Your background is beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I had to get a screen because of backlight, so...
Sure. The joys of teaching in the era of Zoom.
Yes.
To anyone out there who's listening, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Claire Martin, the Assistant Artistic Director of Sweet Tea Shakespeare, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by one of my absolute mentors and heroes, Dr. Sara Freeman. Sara was my undergraduate professor of theater arts at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, where she teaches theater history. She taught me dramaturgy. She teaches a whole sort of plethora of courses for all across the age range of freshman to senior. And she was my gateway drug, I suppose, into restoration theater. So part of the reason I brought her on the show today is because Sweet Tea Shakespeare is launching a huge sort of multi-month restoration project that is supported by the Arts Council of Fayetteville and Cumberland County. And Sarah is here to sort of like help me launch that and celebrate that, and also just provide some context about what this era is and why it's important, why it matters to us as artists and women, but also why it sort of continues to resonate, especially in our sort of current cultural moment of COVID and the 2020 election. So Sarah, I'm so happy to have you on the show. Thank you for making time for us.
I'm super glad to be here.
So when I was a sophomore, I think I took Theater History 2 with you. So first of all, why don't you just give us an idea of Theater History 1 and 2 and why you sort of divide them that way, and then we can go from there.
Sure. I mean, I do teach theater history in a chronological way as opposed to a thematic or some other sort of constellation way. I teach 1 and 2 across the year, fall and spring, but students don't have to take them in order. So fall is the beginning of time to 1700, right? So there's a lot of scope to be done there in terms of historiography and what it means to deal with antiquity and then different periods. And I come up to 1700 in that class primarily in Spain and France, so that we end strong on sort of neoclassical ideal and 17th and sort of budding 18th century French theater and court theater. And then I find it useful to start theater history too in England in the 17th century and bridge into the 18th century. So we actually sort of start theater history too in 1660 with the Restoration. And that helps us review and overlap for people who've gone continuously through. For people who are taking theater history 2 before they take theater history 1, it allows them to get some vocabulary that is helpful about the way that things from the sort of pre-Enlightenment and early modern periods, right, especially in Europe, play out in things we see in the 18th and 19th century. So we start with the Restoration and really think about, again, what's being restored, right? The restoration of what, right? And what does that mean for theater? And then the sort of changes that are happening there in especially English theater, because there's not as many changes happening in French and Spanish or German theater, much less world forms across the 18th century, but in England some stuff is happening that's then going to flower across the whole 18th century as well, and is really determinative to how a lot of things look in the 19th century too.
Yeah. And I took the classes out of order, so I hadn't taken Theater History 1, I didn't have that beginning of time to 1700 vocabulary or context in my brain. I was just diving in as a sophomore who had still not declared a theater major. I was still an English major. And I signed up for the course, and we started with this era I had really never heard of. Like, I may have read about it at some point, but most of my classical theater knowledge kind of began and ended at Shakespeare. And he was pre-Restoration, and sort of the idea of like theater like being as great and transformative as he made it in the sort of second half of the 17th century was just not a concept I had been introduced to. And like, it was a shock for me to find out that, you know, for instance, the Restoration referred to the restoration of a king to a throne instead of like the restoration of like theater itself, which is what I had assumed. And that is what it became, right? Because the theaters reopened. Charles loved the theater. He had seen so much of it during his voluntary exile. He had become familiar with Molière. You know, he had seen plays. He'd seen women on stage. His 27-year-old head was full of all of the, you know, sort of like starry-eyed amazement that theater on the continent conjured for him. And so he comes back. He is restored to the monarchy. We have a king again. Things have gone back to normal, heavy quotes. And he opens the playhouses. He creates this theater duopoly with Davenant and Killigrew, and gives them licenses to start theater companies. And he says, this time you can hire women. And it's just like, it was a restoration of the theater in some ways, but it was also it ushered in a totally new era of theater making. It wasn't just restoring; it was also initiating. It was especially for women. Inauguration is a great word. Yeah.
You say a voluntary exile.
I mean, it's kind of like if someone points a gun to your head and says like, take the pill that will kill you, right? like he did keep himself. I guess he could have tried to come back and like, you know, take back the throne by force, but he waited until Cromwell died, which was probably the right course of action. And also he waited until, again, I don't know, he held off, or he was held off until he was old enough to actually rule, because he got booted out when he was 18. Like, we're all stupid at 18. I don't know how anyone expected him to to run a kingdom at that age, or to sort of save it from what was sort of happening in the Parliament. But he came back at 27, right? We're a little bit more competent then, and so so he comes back. He opens the playhouses. He says we're going to have theater. He commissions playwrights. He commissions plays, and we get this sort of. I think of it as like a first wave of Restoration theater, and that's really where we started in theater history too. Is we started with this like initial, burgeoning of sort of a new theater, post interregnum, post Dark Days theater, that was very much like the pendulum swinging, right? Yep. From the sort of complete lack of theater and artistic storytelling in public spaces to like a Xanadu of really like broad, vibrant, raunchy, racy, insane theater that was like everything, probably all, it was every impulse that had been stifled during the Puritan reign. And yeah, like there was this huge, it was the complete opposite. And so that's why we get so many comedies.
Well, and it's worth noting, right, that when the theaters open, they don't have any new material, right? Like, no one has been writing plays in anticipation of theaters opening when he makes the proclamation. So there is this little ramping up period where they do Shakespeare again, right? Like, sort of resurrect Shakespeare and Fletcher, and they do a little bit of this and that. And then they also try to write heroic tragedies, right? So, and this is partially in relationship to the French model and to neoclassicism too. But they don't really find their rhythm, right, until the comedies. And some of that is adapting Shakespeare plays into the type of wit comedy that really dominates, right? Amazing. But others of it is just, now they get to invent whole cloth social comedies of their time, right? And so yes, there's this huge wave of new writing, right? And I'll just note that, like, The Country Wife premiered in 1675, right? It takes 15 years in. Yep. Right, and the other play that we will talk about today is a contemporary play called Playhouse Creatures, which is April D'Angelis's feminist play from the late 1990s about those first actresses and sort of this period. And there's a lovely monologue where the actress Mrs. Betterton, Mr. and Mrs. Betterton, who have lived through the interregnum, who are young actors, in sort of the end of Shakespeare's lifetime and in the sort of moment of the Civil War, have lived and found a way to survive and toured the continent, right, during the interregnum, and that they are among the companies that are restarting. So Betterton is the sort of lead actor-manager of the King's Company, right, and one of the lovely pieces of research that DeAngelis puts into Playhouse Creatures is this monologue from Mrs. Betterton about what the season of 1663 will be for the King's Company, right? And so that's like 3 years in, and you can see in it that they're like, we're still doing some Shakespeare, we're adapting this thing, right? And one of the characters in Playhouse Creatures is Thomas Otway, who is, trying to write heroic tragedies, trying his name as a writer of heroic tragedies, but also then helps bring forward the sort of wit comedy that we really. So then to get to Wycherley, right? Country Wife it really marks that early period. But just to note, it takes a moment to re-ramp up an entire industry and create a whole bunch of new content. Yeah. It really does make me think about what happens post 2020, 2021, theater hasn't stopped, right, during this period. All sorts of important discoveries, experiments, continuations, and also breakthroughs and departures are happening. But I do think that when the moment comes that we get to make theater in all the ways we want to make theater, right, there's going to be a ramping up again. There's going to be a period, right, where we're sorting out the mishmash that we have been working through, having to live with quarantine and develop our sort of virtual ways, and it might take, things are maybe moving a little faster now, but it might take 3 to 5 years before we really see the kabam of new material that comes out post-COVID, or at least post-COVID sort of shutdown, right?
Yeah. And we'll have to grapple with what we want our theater to be about and what we want it to say. It's no coincidence that The Strapping King came back and a bunch of heroic tragedies were written. But I also know that when we were working on The Way of the World, which was an audio drama that is dropping on October 19th. Hooray, we have a date! It's dropping in a couple of weeks, and it is marvelous. I think I'm allowed to say that, even though I'm in it. Independently of me, it's good. All the other actors are good. And that was sort of the unintended first project in the digital restoration series, which is this sort of 6-month interrogation that I'm doing into the plays that were written and produced sort of from about 1675 all the way until Hannah Cooley in 1780 with the Bell Stratagem, so all the way through the 18th century. 18th century. And we're looking at these plays. I'm looking at them sort of with questions, right? I'm looking at them with real interest, right? What topics are they lighting on, and why might they be lighting on them, and how are each of these authors grappling with these kind of bigger existential questions about love and marriage and sex and money and politics and hypocrisy? What are they doing with these themes, and why are they continuing to return to them beyond the fact that people just wanted to see it? How are they navigating the shifting class structure of England, and how are they navigating the fact that the world is just growing? The world is just expanding beyond anything they thought it could be. And, I think that when we, as a society, especially as an American society, with everything happening politically right now, when we come out of COVID, whatever that looks like, when we can at least be heartbeats in a room again and have that part of theater back. Yeah. What are going to be the things we prioritize on a thematic level for our stories, but also just practically with those heartbeats. Who are those heartbeats going to belong to? Who are those people going to be? Who are we going to put on our stages and insist on seeing on our stages that maybe is different than it was going in, right? So, instead of saying women can be on stage now, obviously we're long past that, but, is there going to be some sort of, prioritization, especially of the bigger regional theaters, that, acting companies, right, must be at least 50% BIPOC artists. Like, is that going to be a thing that we prioritize and think about and grapple with? Is that going to be a thing that playwrights are starting to like really, incorporate into their work and think about on a deeper level? And so, yeah, like I think we are headed for a restoration of theater, our own restoration, and that's partly why these plays are so resonating with me so deeply right now. I'm finding hope in them. I'm finding guidance in them, and I'm also like a little alarmed because there are so many things these plays are scared of. And we're gonna totally be in the same boat. Like when we the next time we can all be in a room together making theater, there's gonna be so much that we're scared of. But I do agree there will also be a ramping up period where we're looking backwards. Like what material do we already have, even if it's just from the past 10 years or so, that we can like fiddle with and remount, that we know will delight and please and entertain, while we try to figure out like, okay, what's next.
Yeah, very true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, something about the restoration plays is that they are they strike us as very formal because there's a sort of investment in the rigor of the language, right? And there's a sort of thinking about the sort of parts of scenes and acts that's still very contained in this sort of cleanly structured way, right? That feels secure. But I really feel the plays are quite wild.
They are.
Incredible wildness, right? Of like, what are they going to do next? And like, really, you're going to put that on stage? And they're going to say that out loud? And it's going to be this messy. I mean, it's really paradoxical how clean and structured and tight we might think they are, just because we don't use language the way that 17th and 18th century people used language, and we don't study poetry, and we don't study classical rhetoric at large in quite the same way, right? But how insanely messy the plays are, too, how really fun and sort of, and the way that intrigue plays out, which, and disguising and sort of tricks, and those are things that are harder to read, right, so that they're referred to and they talk through them a lot in the plays, right, but it's really hard to track in just reading the text as opposed to hearing it or seeing it, where you're like, oh, right, he's hiding in a closet and sticking his head out of the door to commentary, right? Like, or she's pretending this, right? And they're trying to keep up this pretense, but it's about to be shattered because this other person is going to come in the room. Or he's disguising himself as the out-of-town uncle. And now I'm thinking about School for Scandal, right? But he's not. And then the real out-of-town uncle arrives, right? So, like, all this just wildness and intrigue that you do sort of want to be in the room watching. It's so fun to track when that happens. And the actors have so much fun sharing with an audience when you're right in the room, right? And just thinking about the Restoration Playhouse as indoors, fully indoors, as opposed to the outdoor Elizabethan public theaters, right? Packed full of people in a way our fire codes would never allow.
Sure.
Really, like, everyone's really close to each other and close to the stage, and people sitting on the stage, and no sense of fourth wall convention, so the actors are talking to you and sort of constantly stepping in and out of their sort of performer persona, fame self, and the role that they're supposed to be playing. There's not this notion that they're going to completely disappear into the character and just present a convincing illusion of that character the whole time, right? They are very much like contemporary famous people who take on roles where we go to see them and we're like, well, yes, they're playing that character in the show, but so I'm watching this famous star that I want to watch be themselves, right? Yeah. Or I want to watch activate that sort of fame persona, and there's fun in them moving back and forth between it, right? Freedom to talk to the audience, right? Freedom for the audience to talk to you, right? Freedom to interrupt what you're doing and, like, insert a jig, which is something Nell Gwynn was famous for, right? And so that these wild plots and these sort of outrageous things that happen, there's a lot of mileage about getting to enjoy, like, when you're in a performance and you've done something that might offend the audience a little, but also might excite them, right? Both intellectually and sort of sexually, as well as maybe just, shake things up, right? Like, do it, and then, like, get to share that together, that's happened, right? Like, that's very much alive in Restoration comedy. It's one of the things Playhouse Creatures captures, too. There's a sort of knowingness, a sort of freedom to be like, I am talking to you. Do you see what we're showing you, right? Like, isn't this fun and fascinating to do this together and be right up next to each other, right?
Absolutely. And that's been the hardest part about starting to grapple with these scripts, because I am doing my own, I call them cuttings, but they're really adaptations, because I'm doing a lot of rewriting. I'm doing with these plays what the Restorationists were doing with Shakespeare. If there's stuff that doesn't work, or if there's stuff that I want to change in order to speak to a theme that feels more resonant today, or I want to shift a character slightly, or shift our perspective on a character, so that we sort of we look at the archetype with fresh eyes. I'm just straight up doing that. I've essentially rewritten Act 5 of The Rover. Like, my Act 5, like, if scholars are coming to observe my rehearsals very shortly, so I think I'll be contending with these questions soon. But, like, if a scholar were to come and see a production of this on stage, or a theater reviewer who is familiar with the original text, they would be like, "What?" and it's yeah. I mean,
that's you say, have I done anything worse than Joanne Akalaitis did? In the 80s, you just push back a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I'm totally willing to defend my choices, but I'm not being precious about the text. I've never been a purist about classical texts as much as I love them. I just change whatever I want all the time. And I know someday that'll get me into trouble, but for right now, it's just the way that I work. And so there's 8 scripts. There's 8 full scripts in this digital restoration series, which we call the DRS. So we're doing 5 audio dramas. That is The Way of the World, The Rover, The Man of Mode, and then a project that I'm calling the Stratagem Project, which is the Bose Stratagem and the Bell Stratagem in rep with the same company of actors. The exact same, 1-to-1 ratio. Awesome. And then I'm doing 3 table reads, which release The Country Wife, Mary Pix's The Beau Defeated, and William Congreve's Love for Love. And with Love for Love, we're bringing back the exact same company of actors that did The Way of the World at the beginning of the project, because William Congreve wrote the 2 plays for the same company. Yeah. So that's a lot of scripts that that I'm spending a lot of time with, and a lot of time not just cutting and trimming and amending for clarity, but also just in some cases rewriting. And it's been so hard to spend time with these plays and these characters that are so rife with, as you say, action and chaos and messiness, and know that, like, I won't be able to conjure any of it visually. Yeah. It all has to be done through the voice. And so that means amending the scripts sometimes so that the characters can say what on stage they would be able to do for the audience, right? It's finding a way to textually or through sound effects. I work with my sound team to somehow evoke the abject insanity of the things that would be happening physically on stage. And I don't know what we're going to do with Country Wife, but I have some ideas.
Hey, tell me about your cutting of Country Wife. Tell me about how that adaptation rewrite is looking, or things you're excited about it at this point. So
I basically set a limit for myself of 20.5 thousand words per show. That's still in an audio drama. That's still 2 hours and 20 minutes. Yeah. It's still, but we're releasing them by the act, right? So each audio drama will be released act 1, act 2, act 3, act 4. So it's really going to be, the episodes are going to be more like 20-ish minutes, 20, 30 minutes. Right. So it should be more digestible for listeners. And they'll get to sort of have the, like, this week on, previously on, and then there'll be, like, intros and outros that get them in and out of the story.
Little epilogues and prologues.
Yeah, that I'm writing that are just in my own voice, being like, hey friends, this is what this play is about. So with Country Wife, I should say the last piece is I'm also cutting and adapting the scripts towards my actors, because now I have this amazing throng of like 25 actors that I have worked with multiple times, will be working with consistently throughout the DRS, who are like they are just committed. They're committed to the project. They're lending me an extraordinary amount of time, artistry, and energy. I think because they just miss theater. I don't think it has much to do with me as it does with like this ache in their soul to just make art and tell stories. But I am so grateful to them, and I at some point I will just like I don't know, like name them. I'll just like list them all in a live stream because their names deserve to be out in the universe. But I know who they are, right? I know their strengths as actors now because I'm working with them multiple times. I know their ethoses as actors, but also as people. I know how they read, especially audibly. Like, I know what their voice conjures and can conjure. And so I'm adapting my scripts towards that. So with Rover, for instance, like I made syntactical choices and sort of adaptive choices that I never would have made if I had different actors in the roles. And so with Country Wife, for instance, this is a great example. So I knew that I had two of my dearest friends, Bernardo Mazandar and Jamie Sanders, that were going to be playing Sparkish and Harcourt with me as Alethea. And, like, you know, they have very specific energies. Jamie, like, was born to play Restoration Fops, right? He, like, innately understands what they are, what function they serve in the narrative. He can get mean, but he is always endearing. Always endearing. Which is a great, like, way to tackle Sparkish, who can be so just, like, almost reprehensibly stupid. But Jamie's not the villain. He's not the villain. And Jamie does not have that ethos. Jamie is lovable and scattered and, like, totally gregarious. And so, and then Bernardo is not, like, he's not going to play a cynical Harcourt, right? Like, he's not going to play a Harcourt that's like, I want to sleep with that one, so I'm going to hit on her in front of her fiancé. Like, if he sees Alethea, he's going to fall in love with her. And it's going to be true, open-hearted, like, I'm going to do this however I can because I am enthralled, right? So, knowing that, with those chaotic love triangle scenes where there's, like, the wooing happening in front of Sparkish and he doesn't recognize it, like, I played it, I went totally straight with it. I kept a lot of the text that I wouldn't have if I had different actors because I knew, like, all of Sparkish's interjections, I knew Jamie would be able to deliver them in a way that was, like, that would move the story forward, but that would also be really, like, genuinely funny and kind of, like, I don't know, just wonderfully idiosyncratic to the love story. And then I also knew that, like, with Harcourt, like, I kept all of his sort of most impassioned lines because I knew that that's the energy that the actor would take with it. And that's the tack with which you enter the character. So I'm playing that love story truthfully, and I'm actually letting that be, like, the source of real romantic love in the play, or more genuine, equal romantic love in the play. And so I'm really tracking Alethea as, like, holding steadfast to her engagement, not because she wants to, only because, like, she is really genuinely trying to be an honorable person. She just really doesn't want to hurt anybody. And so I'm not playing that cynically at all. I'm playing that very forthright. And so that totally affected what text I kept and what I cut. And then with the Pinchwifes, for instance, the couple, they're an actual couple that are playing Jack and Marjorie Pinchwife. So, like, I can keep stuff that, like, I don't know if I would impose on random actors who are meeting it for the first time at a table read. Like, I can include all the weird stuff.
All the, like, bud and, like, like, baby doll, little girl things that Marjorie Pinchwife does, and and all the horrors that his like pomposity visits upon them. And also knowing that Kelsey, who's playing Marjorie Pinchwife, like, she absolutely can play bimbo because she's a marvelous actor, but, like, there's real wit under everything she says. They're both really sharp actors. They're really intelligent reading actors. And so I've adapted Marjorie away from country bumpkin and more towards, like, quizzical. Like, I just want to know about the world. Like, I know I'm not stupid. The world tells me I'm sort of dumb because I'm from the country. I'm not
I'm just inexperienced, but I want to learn. Like, someone teach me. I just want to know stuff. And she's kind of like a little Ravenclaw. And I've sort of like nudged her in that direction textually, because that's more how Kelsey reads. So things like that.
Love it.
Mm-hmm. We actually have two couples. We also have a couple playing Horner and Lady Fidget, so that will also make to listen delightful.
Really a couple. You know, I mean, Horner is a rake, right?
Yes, so he is.
Horner's with everyone. I would like a really queer Horner someday, like a really queer Horner, right? Which is part of the implication of his, the rumor he puts around town. The rumor he puts around town that he's impotent, right? So he's safe to be around your wife, which is not true. But there's just something, sort of profligate and pansexual about him that I think would be fun in our world to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, it's also interesting to me in that play. Maybe it's because it just came out of Way of the World, where there's like 3 fops that are all very different, and they're like running amok in that play. And we have, like, our sort of leading guy being like, I can't handle this anymore. Like, they're driving me up the wall. And then to, like, go into the Country Wife, where there's this trio, there's this, like, squad of guys who just absolutely take the mickey out of the one fop. Sparkish is totally on his own. Like, in a world of wits, he's, like, the one guy in a periwig, and he's like, I don't understand why you're all, like, laughing. Was there a joke? Did I miss the joke? And that, to me, it's very fun. It was very fun to work on cutting Rover and Country Wife, because there's a very similar vibe between the Cavaliers and Blunt and the like Horner, Harcourt, Dorlent versus Sparkish.
Yeah,
just the runt of the litter.
Well, and there is something about those Restoration comedy that sort of bros plays, right? They're sort of bro comedies, right?
Yeah.
In that, and especially because the playhouses, though they could be visited by many people, were heavily populated by young men about town, right? The Starks and the Wits, and that it is really worth understanding this particular mode of play as entertainment for a young sort of somewhat elite or striving to be elite class of men, right? Yeah. Who now have the freedom to carouse and celebrate that way, right? And some of them are older. You get older men who go to the theater too, right? But really the sense that space is a young person's popular culture space, and that part of what they want to see is their social types reflected and getting over on each other, right? And enjoying that, right?
Yeah. It's so I'm learning so much about just myself as an artist by working on these plays, about just what I love and what speaks to me and what I sort of continually return to. I think I didn't say this at the beginning. I've had Sara on the show before. She was my guest earlier, and we had a marvelous conversation about sort of received Shakespeare towards the end of the 20th century, especially with regards to Gay Sweatshop and just kind of the other those like more like radical theater groups that were like really reconstructing the canon in the 80s and 90s in England. And so we talked about this. I mentioned to you that like what I love about Margaret Atwood as a writer is the way that she's constantly thinking about this very like delicate gossamer weaving of marriage, sex, money, politics, and power. She's like always got them in her head. And even if she sort of focuses on one in her poems or essays or novels, like all those themes are going to show up at some point. She's always thinking about how specifically like sex, money, and politics, like how they are latticed together, and the way that the patriarchy like suffuses all of them. And that's what I love about her. That's what I've always loved about her. That's also what I love about the Restoration, right? There's something about these themes that are really interesting to me. Similarly with so my favorite plays in the world are the 4 plays in Shakespeare's Henriade, right? So Richard II, Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2, and Henry V. And what I love about those plays is I think they're just a really interesting interrogation of like masculinity. Not just kingship, but specifically like men and like the generational violence of the patriarchy, right? Of fathers and sons. It's just fascinating to me. And what I've loved about Rover is my poor actors, they've been subjected to so many rants of mine about toxic masculinity, and the way that this play like continues to speak to our present moment. And I realized, like, oh, it's the Henriad, right? It's those same conversations that we would be having if we were working on Henry IV Part 2, of, like, what are these guys doing, right? But it's not just what are they doing, it's what have they been taught, what is the water that they're swimming in that makes them think that this is how they should be behaving and how they should be, posturing. And so, like, I'm realizing, like, there's themes that I'm really, really interested in. Like, I love, like, sex, marriage, and power, and money. I'm just like, all of it. Give me all of it. Because I think there's so much to mine there. Obviously, the playwrights of the Restoration were just mining and mining and mining and mining. And Wycherley does it to, like, I think to perfection in The Country Wife. That play is, like, savagely insightful about marriage.
Yeah, savagely, right? Like, one of the things we do often meditate on in theater history is, like, in some ways the darkness of the end of it, right? Like, yeah. the trueness of Harcourt and Alethea, right, is important, but, like, it is really a pretty savagely dark play, yeah. about the question of inequality, of how economic privilege is protected, of sort of sexual double politics, right? Like, Restoration comedies are sexual double standards, I mean, right? Yeah. Restoration comedies are quite libertine, right? And they grant women a certain space of libertineness as well, yeah. Right? Sort of fun, but there's also a sort of darkness, right, about social world and judgment, in Wycherley at least. It gets much more gentle across the 18th century as sort of the Restoration, sort of city comedy gets tempered with a sort of notion of sentimentality, right? But Wycherley is actually really hard, I find, at the end, even though you're laughing. You're like, oh, am I just laughing out of nihilism? Right?
Yeah, totally. Totally.
And then After Bane, right, of course, the play is brilliant, or the Rover is brilliant, both as an embodiment, but also as a critique, although I do find, right, at least in teaching, class where I can't just only assign Restoration plays to read for weeks on end, right, I do have to keep moving because I'm going to make it to the present by the end of theater 2, right, and this is why it's so great that you're doing the DRS, right? Like, this really deep dive is so worth it and so important, right? But I really struggle because sometimes I want to assign the Rover in theater history too, and sometimes I do. But often I assign the Country Wife. I'm often not going to assign both. But one of the things I sort of struggle about assigning the Rover is that I think that you don't truly understand Bane's critique, or like what she's doing, or the brilliance of what she's doing, if you don't already know what something like The Country Wife or The Man of the Mode looks like and is doing. So to see how she is doing it par excellence right alongside them and also turning it, right? And being what 20th century feminists would say, being a resistant reader to it, right? Like, and recasting the representation to make points while also still providing this rollicking good time, right? For however that's going to work, right? And I do think that's the model that April D'Angelis was working with in Playhouse Creatures, where she's like, this is going to be an awesomely fun play, right? It's going to work in the way that a lot of really sharp, incisive, and comic sort of British history plays do, right? But it's also going to present this critique, right, in this very, very incisive way as it does those things for you. Yeah, there are so many threads and things you have said that I wanted to follow up, but you tell me where.
Sorry, I barrel sometimes.
No, me too. I always have so many responses to what's happening, but you tell me where it would be fun to go for the next little bit of the conversation.
Let's absolutely talk about Playhouse Creatures. You're more familiar with the play than I am. I've only read it, and it's been a while, but I did some sort of preliminary research before our thing today, just so I could keep up. But maybe if you just gave our listeners like just a blurb about what the play is about, and then we can kind of talk about like why it is such a sort of important critique of the Restoration, and what it's doing in terms of being a feminist lens to the era.
Yeah, and really a critique for our times too, right? Like, I mean, as much as it's a critique of restoration, it's rendering that critique to help us think about our times, right? Yeah. And what indeed does economic liberation look like? What indeed does gender and sexuality liberated look like, right? You know, one of the real dilemmas of both the Restoration and our time is if we are more free, especially women and feminine people, if we are more free to be present in the public and to present our sexualities, right? Is that freedom, or is that another mode of oppression when we get commodified for it, right? Yeah. Like, so as the great performance studies theorist Peggy Phelan says, right? If representation equaled power, then naked young white women would be the most powerful people in the world, right? Because those are that visibility. It was actually about power, yeah. Right? Then naked young white women would be the most powerful people in the world, right? And so there's this real double-edged sword in terms of like, okay, so women are on stage, women get all this new latitude, there's all this playfulness and like ability to express and reveal and all these things, but also that gets commodified, right? That is commodified, and can be also used as a bludgeon against you. And I think that's a very real story in the 90s and the 21st century, as real as it was at the end of the 17th century and in the 18th century. So Playhouse Creatures is an inquiry into the sort of arrival of actresses on the stage. They are the Playhouse Creatures, although the first monologue of the play is a monologue by a sort of fabulated sort of concocted character who's representative of several different types of people who may have existed, who's named Doll Common, so in the way of a sort of speaking name, right, from the 18th, Restoration 18th century, Doll being sort of like Moll, Doll, right, like just a sort of girl, common, right. She's an older woman now, or middle-aged woman. When we see her, she's lived through the closures of the theaters, and she's sort of our narrator / way in, and she does a monologue about the playhouses having also been bear baiting and dog baiting arenas, right, in both Shakespeare's time and in the Restoration time, and really opens the play with that vision of like, when you perform here, you are performing things that your society wants you to do, sometimes on pain of violence, right? So that the bear dances for its whip, right? The whip that its master has, and there's a real parallel there for her in reflecting on the first women to perform in the playhouse, right? Like, on the one hand, they achieve fame and riches, right? And are freed of other things that are causing them trouble, right? But on the other hand, they're still dancing for a whip, and for some of them, they evade it and exceed it in certain ways, and in other ways, it still does them in, right? And Doll's sort of narration on that front, and the way she tracks, is matched by Mrs. Betterton, who's one of the characters, right? Who, as an aging actress in the company, is really not getting the fame that the young new actresses are. Yeah. She's allowed to act now instead of just being her husband's supporter, right? So she gets to play Cleopatra, and she gets to play Lady Macbeth, but she's also, not available to be the mistress of the courtiers, right? Like, she's not considered a sexual draw necessarily on stage, and she really feels the bite and the sting of that, but she really speaks through the play a discourse of craft, right? A discourse of acting being a great calling and a skill and a set of craft, and as an artist, right? She's the one who's like, we're here for the art, right? But of course, part of what the play is showing us is the way that the economics of the class economics and the sexual economics mean that many of the women who are in the space may be great artists, but what's really determining their lives are their opportunities, how the money comes and what that means in terms of their respectability and other options, right? Yeah. So I've talked about the framing devices a little bit, but like the center of the play is essentially about the rise of 3 different actresses across the early Restoration, right? So that we meet 2 characters in the first scene after we get through the the frame, Mrs. Farley and Nell Gwynn, and Nell Gwynn's a serving wench in a tavern, right, and Mrs. Farley is a Puritan who's out trying to convert people, and both of them are running up into against trouble because they're harassed in their work, right, and neither of them have as stable of an income as they would like. Nell, because she's just working, in sort of poverty, right, service sector, right, and Mrs. Farley, because she adheres to a religious sect and a religious idea that says God will provide for her, but, he's not really providing much, she often is not eating, right, and Tom Otway is drunk at the tavern in that scene, right, and he starts telling them about, the playhouses and the magic that happens there and the gold lace and the fact that women can perform. So the next scene we see is Mrs. Farley has become an actress, right? She's left aside her religious convictions and she's become an actress, which is a really interesting move because the Puritans continued to protest the playhouse.
They did.
That whole century, right? But that many of the same skills that causes you to succeed in a church or in a proselytizing religion are also skills that allow you to succeed as a performer, right? So Miss Farley is now sort of the new sensation on stage, right? And Nell is selling oranges in the playhouse because people ate refreshments in the playhouse. So both of them have stepped up, but Nell hasn't hit the stage yet, right? And Mrs. Farley attempts to block her and sort of quality control. You're still sort of gutter snipe scum, whereas I'm ascending as an actress. And Mrs. Marshall is already there. She's the mistress of the king, right? So they're sort of patrolling the sort of quality control of who gets to be on stage. Oh, I should say Mistress Marshall has gone to meet the king, but really she's the mistress of the Earl of Rochester, who's another really important patron. Yep. But he's tricked her, and they are in this big. It's a plot turn out of a Restoration comedy. She told him she wouldn't sleep with him until they were married, so he agreed to marry her, and they steal away in the middle of the night to get married, but it's a false marriage. He's paid another actor to pretend to be a priest, and he's abandoned her now, right? So it's a plot twist worthy of,
totally.
The state. Right?
It's Harcourt rolling up being like, I'm a priest now.
Right, exactly. Okay, so really we watch Nell and Mrs. Farley rise as actors because Nell talks her way onto the stage. She freezes the first time she's there, but then she dances a jig and she is an audience favorite, right? Yeah. And at the very end of Act 1, you meet Mrs. Barry, who's another young hopeful who's trying to transcend her constraints, and she comes into the playhouse and she's like, this is a magic space, right? And all she sees is the magic. She doesn't heed Doll Collins' warning about the bear baiting, right? Pits and the sort of double nature of this space. And then you watch across Act 2, similarly, Mrs. Barry rise. She becomes the Earl of Rochester's protege and lover, right? You see the different types of material. April DeAngelis does this beautiful job of weaving in sections of existing Restoration, both heroic tragedies and comedies, and then also sort of fabulating some to serve her ends, right? So you get to see the type of things that emerge over that first 20 years after the Restoration in terms of what the performers can perform. And you see them all negotiate really different, really complicated paths with the problem of not being respectable women anymore because they perform as actresses and they are lovers to maybe many men, right, who are their patrons and who provide them with the costumes and the sort of support they need, right? And you see them battle to have full economic rights in the theater company's economic structure so that they want to become shareholders, right? They want to not be just paid by the performance, they want to be shareholders in the company, like the male actors, right? So that they aren't as dependent on patrons giving them money to, right, float what's happening. Yeah. And there's some type of triumph, right? Nell Gwynn becomes the king's mistress. She has children by him, and in the end he settles enough money on her that she can sort of retire away and not suffer, although she's not valorized, right? But you see Mrs. Marshall just fight a horrible battle, harassed because of her relationship with the Earl of Rochester. Mrs. Farley fall out of favor and be pregnant and soon be begging in front of the theater where she used to perform. Mrs. Barry rise and how she protects her rise alongside Earl of Rochester. So it's just a very powerful play about both the freedom and the trade-offs of taking on fame in that representational space, right?
Yeah.
And performing that material, right? Both its absolute joys and its and the way it still replicates sort of the sexual objectification of women and the sort of containment of them into sort of either two options. Either you're a respectable woman or you're not, right? And if you're a respectable woman, then you have to navigate the marriage plot, which has its own oppressions. And if you're not a respectable woman, then you're going to deal with all these other demands, right? So that the actresses are always being asked to sort of show their legs or bare their breasts or play a rape scene on stage, and they're like,
yeah,
sick of it. Right?
Totally.
You know.
I mean, just in the course of one play, like my actor playing Florinda, like every time we get towards the end of the play, she's like, "Fuck, again? Can't believe this is happening again!" Like, right? So, and that's contained in one play that my actor is like, seriously, I have to go through this, this almost assault again. Yeah. And again, that's after Bane doing something very specific, but that was one of the that threat of assault depicted on stage against a woman's body it's all over the place. I mean, it's just that scene permeates so much restoration drama, comedy and tragedy.
It is a set piece, right? Well, there's a very funny piece, a sort of rehearsal scene in Playhouse Creatures, right? Where the actresses are in rehearsal with Otway, and they just lay him out on this front. They're like, oh, and now you're going to tell us to do this, and now we're going to do this. And Nell's like, I want some jokes. And Otway says things like, this play is a serious indictment of primogeniture, right? And Nell says, it's tit after tit, right? Right? Marcella spies Dorothea asleep on the grassy knoll, tits hanging out. Dorothea discovered praying in her boudoir, other tit hanging out. Vincula struggles violently with Dorothea in the lonely cloisters, both tits out simultaneously, right? They just lay Otway out on this in that scene, and it's a wonderful scene. It's such a funny scene, right? But then also, like Wycherley, just savage in terms of what. In terms of you being to be like, what do we do about this now, right? So, because of course we want our plays to be exciting, we want them to be sexy, we want them to be delightful, right? And it really is something to contend with, right? Like the degree to which things that excite us and delight us, right, and feel sexy on stage, like how much do they have to replicate the violences and inequalities we live with to produce those effects, right? Because they're linked, right? Because things that feel entirely safe very rarely feel entirely sexy, right? And it's just a really hard thing in terms of performance, right? And this is a very sexy period.
Yes, it is. Which makes it even like all the funnier to do it on Zoom. Like, I'm often having to encourage my actors to just remember, like, what would be happening if we were in the rehearsal room, because I think that it can feel sterilized when you're just reading a script on Zoom. Like, you're like, oh yeah, there's nothing happening. Like, even if the language is suggestive, like, whatever, it's, it's text on a page, and I'm like, friends, remember, like when, and I was having a conversation with Ron, who's playing Wilmore for me. And, he gets my favorite line, not just in The Rover, but possibly in any piece of literature ever. Like, I love no line like I love There's No Sinner Like a Young Saint. Like, I love it with all my heart and soul. I think it's one of the best things ever written. And I'm, like, endlessly, like, I want it on my gravestone someday. I love that line. And he's a spectacular actor who every time we've done that first meeting between the two of them, keeps Emily on her toes and is just so much fun to work with. But I did tell him, I was like, I don't think you understand. like you have to remember, when she tells him she's going to be a nun, like, if this was on stage, she would be wearing like the lowest cut corset you can imagine, right? Like, she looked up sexy gypsy on Google and put on every piece that she saw on the mannequin, right? Like, she is, you have to, when you look at her, you can't see Emily in her sweatshirt in her bedroom. You have to see, like, this is a teenage girl who is, like, got it all hanging out, wearing every piece of inappropriate clothing her brother would never approve of, telling him, I'm gonna be a nun. That's why it's funny. That's why he's so kind of, like, surprised and delighted, and that's why they have that conversation, is because it seems so absurd to him because of the visual intel he's receiving from her. And so sometimes when we're rehearsing, like I have to sort of ply them with that like visual reminder and physical reminder of what would be really happening if we were in the room, and why these texts are as like sort of sexually and physically activated as they are. And then with, my actor playing Blunt, like Jordan is constantly telling me, he's like, gosh, it's so weird to have no way of like actually showing the threat. He's like, the words are insufficient, right? The words don't conjure what this scene is about. And I don't know how to make them do that, because what the scene is about is so important. And the whole point is that it's not words. It is active. And he's like, I don't want to do the action, but I also feel like, don't people need to see it for the scene to work? Like, for the scene to have that sort of contemporary resonance of like, me too, like, don't we need to see it? So we're having those kinds of conversations as well, of like, what, obviously there's less chance of me exploiting my actors physically on stage if we're all securely locked on the Zoom screen, but also, what does that do for the emotional resonance of some of these moments if we only have our voices? So we're sort of having those big existential questions all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be quite powerful, right? Because when you know what you're performing, right, it comes through, right, in the performance. And it may be, again, this is something that I think we may be really thinking about right now in our world, where there's so much more attention to sort of the power dynamics of representation, of presenting exciting and sort of both politically and sexually stirring material on stage, right? Like that like one of the benefits of this period of working in Zoom may be, right, that it enforces a bit of physical distance and allows us to sort of like engage with it as content and convey it before we have to put our bodies on the line again, because really the last 10 years have been, a negotiation and negotiation about how rehearsal rooms work, right? About intimacy coordination, about sort of what is sort of the actors' Bill of Rights in terms of their own boundaries, right? What is appropriate behavior for directors, right? And then just thinking about the like in the commercial parts of the industry in film and TV, thinking about the Weinstein scandal and all of that. Like, in some ways, doing really charged material in Zoom gives you a chance to sort of step back, right? And say, let's deal with the really charged material. Our bodies are a little bit less on the line. They're still on the line, right? Like, there's nothing about the mediatized performance that means that it's not on the line, right? Or else we wouldn't have as much, like, cam activity / OnlyFans / porn as there is in the world. But to really think that through again, so that it's like, because I think we do all want to get on stage and be as brave and as fierce and as intense and as sexy, and that we can do that ethically, right? Like, I think those Restoration actresses would have fought that fight. Like, absolutely, I want to get out there and play that heroine and show what an intense moment it is when you're a teenager coming into your sexuality and you're like, I want to flaunt, but I also don't want to be exploited. And I have to have a space to navigate this, right? It doesn't actually hope to be just suppressed either, right? That doesn't actually make me safer, even though maybe it's a little bit less contradictory or something, right? I think we want all of that, and we're making a bunch of newer agreements about how to get there, right? And I think that for the Restoration actresses, right, and this carries through into, I think, the great 19th and early 20th century actresses, that, are their inheritors, right, is that it really was about defining themselves as artists as opposed to sort of prostitutes or just sort of people who are famous for being visible, right? And so I think there is something really important about that conversation. Like, no, there is an art to doing the work. It's not just display, right? There is an art.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been so... I think all of that, I mean, I affirm all of that. I think that's all so true, and it's all, like, heartening to hear, just that reminder of that, like, the double reminder, right? That, like, there can still be true engagement with the text and with the material that is sort of perhaps a little bit more divorced from physical enactment, but also that, like, there's no such thing as non-physical acting. Like, even when we're in front of this camera, like, my actors will totally gesticulate and move around, and I do that too. And as you find your way into the character, it just starts to kind of inhabit you kind of inhabit their body. But also, I also think there have been good conversations that we have plumbed maybe deeper than we would have in a rehearsal space where we gotta keep moving, we gotta like stage the scene, we gotta block this entrance or whatever. Because those aren't a concern. Like, I have 7 weeks with my Rover cast, and admittedly we're only meeting 7 hours a week, but I have 7 weeks with them, and that's a lot of time for them to just be with their scripts, and be with their characters. And every time we meet, because there's a little bit of space, like we meet on Sundays and Thursdays, there's that little bit of space between rehearsals means that often when they come back, like, they're doing totally new reads of lines, and it's just because they've been able to meditate and really be with their character, knowing they can't do anything physically. So they really are, like, looking at their text, being like, how can I use these admittedly twisty sentences as, like, rocks on the rock wall to sort of climb my way up this character's journey. And so there's an intensity about the way a lot of these actors are, like, attacking the language. And I think there's a depth and kind of breadth to our dramaturgical conversations that we are afforded because we don't have to worry about staging it. We just have to worry about the clarity of the storytelling. And so, it's been really fun, and I hope you can come see Rover. I think it'd be really fun for you to
I'm really excited about Sweet Tea doing this digital restoration series. I think it's going to be such a good resource, such a good experience while it's happening, and then such a good resource forever after. It's a fun period. I'm just happy when people want to muck around in there.
I love it so, and I'm so grateful to you for introducing me to Dr. Misty Anderson. She has, like, lifted the project and is just absolutely has been a beautiful and incredible, compassionate, like, guide into the work. And the R18 Collective has shined a spotlight on this project that kind of blows my mind. So I appreciate you making that connection. Because now, hopefully, there are even more scholars, artists, and dramaturgs out there that will be able to experience these projects because they're going to be in their archive.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Sarah, thank you for joining me today.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm looking forward to watching all the shows. And someday we'll talk about Susanna Santlieber because she's the only one that you're not doing something from, and she's the only one that I've directed one of her shows.
I know.
From the period.
That's what's next.
Okay.
All right, everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye.